We have a good amount of attendees here. I'm ready to get started. Are you, Rebecca?
Absolutely.
All righty. So let me come in here and just say hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar. The webinar is titled Governmental Digital Transformation. You know, one of the most common mistakes when approaching digital transformation is to center the transformation around technology or the how. You know, and we do that sometimes before we have a clear understanding of how it's going to impact our city, the why, or the people in the organization and the customers and the who of it. So today in this webinar, we're going to outline a framework for a thorough and collaborative planning strategy as you march forward and begin your digital transformation journey. Before we dive in there with introductions, let's just run through some quick housekeeping. Our next webinar will be on May 19th at 11 a.m. We're going to be talking about negotiating the labor contract, as we think that this is a timely topic because many of you may be in that process or about to start that process for your next budget year. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar, the slide deck afterwards. But I want to highly I really want to highly encourage everyone on the webinar. Let's make this interactive. Let's just not make it a one-way communication, but let's make it two-way or even three-way, you know, where you're talking to us, we're talking to you, and maybe even have some conversations amongst each other. Zoom over the past year and a half has given me a lot of good practice on how to handle that kind of interaction. So please be interactive, participate, make this interesting. And after the webinar, of course, please reach out to Max at GovInvest and we'll field all your questions that you have. So who is it talking to you today? Well, for those of you that are longtime attendees of GovInvest webinars, you know that I'm Charlie Francis. I'm a retired city finance director. Well, I was kind of retired. You know, after 2015, when I left Sausalito, I started consulting to government technology companies, helping them to build and deliver strategic financial management software. I've also formed a company called the Virtual Gov CFO, and we provide outsourced financial management services to local government. And under that, I actually have a contract now with the city of Sausalito to be their interim finance director. So I'm back as a colleague with many of you again, not just a consultant working for GovInvest. I am really excited today to have Rebecca Woodbury with us, longtime friend of mine, and also a colleague. We worked in neighboring cities, and she's going to be helping us explore this topic of digital government transformation. And Rebecca, let me turn it over to you to introduce yourself and your company.
Great. Thank you. So happy to be here. My name is Rebecca, and I spent the last 12 years working for the city of San Rafael in Northern California. And most recently, I was the director of digital service and open government. So I oversaw technology modernization, data and analytics, community engagement, and service redesign. But recently I left, and I now have a consultancy called the Department of Civic Things. And we are aimed at helping smaller governments do this same work. So one of the things I found was that smaller agencies, many of them didn't even have anyone helping with IT. If they did, they were kind of running around fixing computers. And so I'm hoping to help smaller agencies with the strategic work of digital transformation and digital service delivery. And I just realized I hadn't turned my video on. I don't know if I still can't. So there's my face. You can imagine.
Oh, do you need permission to turn your video on, or?
I'm not sure. I don't know. It's not necessary. It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it, but that's.
Let me see if I can fix that.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about how to create an environment for digital transformation. Digital transformation won't work, especially in the long term, if the work culture itself doesn't support it. So equally important to your technology investments are your investments in your culture. And I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm going to talk about fostering a service-minded culture, empowering product owners, and then also how you design with and for real people. So this might feel like a bit of a fire hose today. On my website, I have a lot of information about the things that I'm talking about, and I'm happy to take questions on anything that kind of piques your interest. So here on this slide, you see, I'm sure you all have heard this in your career, do more with less. I think at this point, it sounds like nails on a chalkboard. and don't get me wrong, I enjoy a variety of things, but sometimes wearing this many hats is just exhausting, not to mention confusing and counterproductive. So if you can go to the next slide, as I believe that to evolve, to meet the new demands and to meet the new challenges, we also have to stop trying to do more with less. And I think it's really about doing the right things with less. And that's hard work. That's not easy to do. This is hard. But to do this hard work, we need really healthy work environments where people feel safe and they thrive in a changing environment. Next slide. So at the end of the day, I think this is about creating a work culture that inspires care and stewardship of our services. So it's not just enough to do the things have to be the right things and they need to be good. So to do this, it takes focus, it takes alignment, it takes intention. It doesn't just happen. So next slide. So our work culture, I see kind of three big components of it. Purpose is created by inspiring and motivating people towards improving things. And we need technology and equipment to be productive. It's really hard to have meaningful impact when you have a slow computer and really clunky software. But alas, that's what most public servants get. And support, this is broad. So it's important to think of it broadly. This is training, this is coaching, this is mentoring, this is recognition. And we need to understand how all these three components work together and find ways to invest in all of them and create alignment between them as well.
Rebecca, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about work culture, can it actually start in the middle of the organization, or does it always have to start at the top of the organization?
Oh, it can start at the bottom. I think that it's wherever it starts, I think it's important to engage all levels of the organization. Absolutely. And I think the top is a really critical place in terms of buy-in and support and helping to unblock things. But I think the real work should not be happening at the top in a lot of ways. I think the real work should be at the bottom or in the middle of the organization. The middle of the organization is a really critical piece, and it's a tricky piece sometimes. But I can go into that in more detail with folks that maybe have a challenging mid-management part of their organization. But I think that all levels are really critical to this, and they fit in different ways. And in some ways, I like the top of the organization just to be supportive, be bought in, but not necessarily being the folks coming up with everything themselves. Great question.
Thanks.
So to create alignment for having a service-minded culture, it's really critical that you tie your employee engagement efforts to service modernization, to digital transformation, right? So it's important to recognize the intersection between the employee experience of government and the community experience of government. And you do this by connecting these things. modernization efforts, they hinge on continuous improvement and cultivating a learning mindset. You cannot have successful digital transformation if you do not cultivate a learning mindset and create this environment. So I've found that three things really need to reinforce each other. People should be recognized for learning and for working cross-departmentally. Learning programs should be cross-departmental, and they should bring people together around the shared challenges and the opportunities. And this cross-departmental piece, we talk so much about the silos in government. And I think it's important to say, what does it look like to de-silo? And I think it means creating actual structure around the horizontal levels of your organization, creating teams that are truly cross-departmental, that bring people together to solve those problems. Because most, if not all, of our pressing problems are cross-departmental in nature. Housing and homelessness, wildfire prevention and safety, permitting. How about internal administrative inefficiencies? Yet some of our most siloed employees are department admins, for example. So really creating alignment around these things and making sure that they reinforce each other, I think, is really critical to the design of this. So you can go to the next slide. So when you do this work, when you are designing this and creating alignment and investing in your work culture, these are some design principles that I think will help. Co-creation, again, Charlie, like you mentioned, involving all levels of your organization to participate and to shape things, not having it all get done at the top and trickle down. It really should be co-created, and that's where you're going to get really meaningful buy-in. And I think it's, some folks say it's HR's job to do this. It's not. This is, work culture is bigger than HR. HR is a critical player in this, but I think it's everyone's job. And I really think this helps make sure that the programs that you do and the learning and all of this stuff really reflects the ideas and the needs of your particular workforce. And part of that is making sure your programs are inclusive. And I think inclusive in a lot of ways. I think people need to feel safe and feel like they belong and can participate. I also think that there's another angle of inclusivity where many of our workforces have folks that work shift work, that work in emergency response, that work public counters. How do you help involve them in some of these cultural initiatives? How do you engage the cop on the night beat, the firefighter in the firehouse? And there are ways to do this. It's hard, and and you have to get creative, but and it will never be perfect, but you need to show effort in this area, or those folks are never going to get bought into this work. And I think making sure that the messaging around this work is really outcomes driven, making things better, improving things. It's a really critical piece to making sure that you are really building effective teams that are driving towards continuous improvement. And then lastly, I think storytelling is a really, it helps to create alignment, and pull everyone together, and it helps people feel recognized, celebrated, and then again to reinforce your stories. So next slide. Don't just tell stories about big projects. Most of this work around digital transformation is actually it's small wins, and making sure that people understand in your organization that a lot of this work is the everyday work that we do. So celebrating the small wins, because every day is a good day to make a form a little less confusing, or a process, or to eliminate an unnecessary step from a process, or clarify some information on your website that could be a little more clear, right? These are the everyday things that we do to make things operate better. So next slide. Oh, we can skip this. I'll send this along. This is a video that the City of San Rafael made. It's a fun, we have a storytelling team that puts together fun videos about employees doing good work that aligns with some guiding principles that we made. I'll send it so people can watch.
Okay. And then how did you share that within the organization? On a YouTube channel or?
Yeah, we have actually an employee YouTube channel, and the employees make videos, and we have a newsletter that goes out to all employees and shares the videos that way. Sometimes they play the videos in staff meetings and things like that. So yeah, they're a lot of fun.
Oh, did you have a governance policy?
No.
Oh, interesting. But any employee could share a video?
Oh, we had a storytelling team that put the videos together.
Ah, great.
Yeah. So there
Exciting.
you go. So here's a checklist. In the interest of time, I won't run through these in a lot of detail, but things to think about as you're doing this work around culture. Guiding principles help to reinforce this work and really get the message that this is around making things better. This is about continuous improvement. This is about questioning the status quo, things like that help to create that environment for digital transformation to be successful. Again, cross-departmental teams, so critical to this work, bringing people together across departments to work on these challenges together, especially the internal administrative challenges that you have around budgets, around forms, around processes that can be real productivity killers in organizations. Team working agreements, I think working agreements are important more than ever when you have remote teams, really getting people to agree on how they're going to work together and get things done and hold themselves accountable to these things. Shaping your recognition programs around those guiding principles, right? So one of the things that we started to do is stop recognizing people for length of service and start recognizing people around innovation and around having an impact in the organization. A storytelling team, again, put some employees responsible and in charge for sharing the successes and socializing these concepts. And then I think offering a diverse range of training opportunities that, again, align with the culture that you're building. So things like book clubs, lunchtime lectures, workshops around things that you're having these conversations about. We had an employee book club, and we were constantly reading books around digital transformation together, and with all employees from all levels of the organization, all departments coming together, sitting in a room with pizza and the city manager talking about OKRs and metrics and, and digital transformation. So I think you can really do a lot to inspire folks through things like that. Okay, so next slide. So actually, I'll pause here and see if the group, I've talked a lot about culture, and one of the things that I think it's good to ask ourselves questions. So what's blocking us from participating? Oftentimes we have good intentions, but people say they're too busy. They're too busy to show up. They're too busy to come together. So I guess I'll open it up to the group to see if anybody has attempted some of this work around culture and run into any blockers that they want to share.
We don't have any questions coming in.
Okay.
I'm trying to, as people are in there, I kind of allow them to talk. So
great.
They
well, we'll move on. We can come back to it. Just want to give an opportunity for me to stop talking for a sec. We can go on to the next slide. So,
but I guess I have just kind of a follow-up question. Sure. on culture. I mean, in San Rafael, I mean, that was part of your job responsibility, or did you just make it a personal responsibility to start with your little small group and then have that culture building be contagious and build out through the whole organization?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think in a lot of ways, the department that we created, that I became the director was a direct evolution of the work that we were doing to change our culture. You know, when I first started doing this work, we had an IT department, and a few years later, after we were getting into, you know, what does it really mean to do digital transformation, we decided we need to change the way we look at technology, and we need to change the way we look at our services. And so we created this department, the Department of Digital Service and Open Government, that IT became a division, a function of. But it was really a direct result of doing this culture work and allowing our this work to evolve and take us in directions we wouldn't have anticipated originally.
Well, I mean, from what I observed in a neighboring city was that your enthusiasm about embracing technology was contagious. It was a contagion that spread all the way up to management making a decision to institutionalize it.
Yeah, no, I think in a lot of ways that's true. I think I have a public policy degree by trade. And so I'm a policy analyst. And so I always want to, you know, design things better, make things better. And I kind of fell into the civic tech movement because I felt that that was a really great group of folks that were trying to do the same thing, make things better, improve things, and not keep doing the same thing over and over again.
That's wonderful. And so it's kind of like the great message is here we are, all individuals on this webinar, but individually we can make a difference in our organizations, and just like you did there in San Rafael.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so I want to dive into a concept that may not be familiar to you. Product management it's very prevalent in the private sector. It's how companies create things that people want, that they seek out over competitors, even get addicted to, for example. So product management is a very, very robust part of the private sector. In the public sector, it is less well known, and it's different, right? So we're not trying to get people addicted to getting parking tickets, but when people do get them, we want the process to be easy, not a hassle, right? So in the public sector, product management has a slightly different context, but some of the methods and the principles are the same in terms of continuous improvement. So in the public sector, also we tend to use the word services more than products. So I'm going to use them interchangeably as I talk about product management. But if you could go to the next slide. So in the private sector, like I mentioned, a lot of product management is about beating your competitors, right? So you have a social media platform, somebody else has a social media platform. So how do I get people to use mine instead of the others, or Coke and Pepsi, right? In the public sector, you know, we like to think that we don't have competition. I would argue, though, that we do. For example, if the neighboring town's library is a lot nicer, people are probably just going to go there to get their books. If a building permit is too cumbersome, too costly, too difficult to get, people will do work without permits. So we may not be in competition for another type of building permit, but we're in competition with people not doing what we want them to do. And so there are all sorts of reasons why we want to encourage and incentivize people to use our products and services. So there's a lot of reasons why we want them to be easy to do, easy to accomplish. And it's not just because we want the revenue, we do, but we also want them to be in compliance, right? So there is an interesting thing to think about when we think about competition. So I do want to stop here. I have some examples of products and ask the group or Charlie, you know, as you think about competition in public sector, what do you think about?
Let's see. We're not getting anything in from any participants, but yeah, when I think about competition, I think the main thing I'm hearing is that we're behind the way the private sector delivers services. So it's not so much as a competition for the service, but it's a competition of the delivery method.
Right. No, that's a really good point too. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, you can unpack this idea of competition in public sector in a lot of different directions. Absolutely.
Yeah. But in terms of service delivery, I mean, over the years of my career, I've explored all different kinds of ways of delivering services, contracting out with the private sector to provide a service,
right.
As well as, you know, doing a hybrid, some contract and some city employee, and then just city employee delivery of service. But the key for me was always trying to keep the service delivery consistent with well, modernized, you know, in other words, continual business process improvement, I think was sort of like the hallmark of my career.
Right. Well, let's get into that. So next
okay,
slide.
wait a second, we got a chat.
Oh, sure.
Another area is recruiting employees from other cities.
Such a, yes, 100%. Employee, getting the best and the brightest into your organization. Absolutely. How about business attraction? Getting businesses to locate.
So right? City versus city, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we just had a recent recruitment for a finance manager, and you know, basically, I really wanted one person from a nearby city, but you felt like that's not right to go poaching one of my colleagues, you know, staff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you, Stuart. Good comment.
Yeah, that's a really good one. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to get into how to do this successfully. So one of the first steps is to make sure that each of your services or products has an owner, right? We call this the product owner. This means that that person is empowered to make decisions about improving the service, and they're also held accountable to the outcomes of the service. And it's when services don't have clear owners in public sector, things really start to deteriorate, especially over time. You see a lot of finger pointing, you see a lot of shirking of responsibility, you see this kind of siloization of services, like somebody is just responsible for their part, right? And you need somebody to be responsible for the whole. Looking at the whole. So when you have a permit, for example, that maybe goes through several different departments, and each department is just thinking about their portion of the permit, that permit is probably not going to be a very good overall process. You really need to assign someone to look after the entire thing, the entire life cycle. And so this is a really critical piece to product management, is empowering somebody with the authority they need to make decisions around that whole life cycle, not just their department's portion, but the entirety. And also really trying to hold them accountable as, you know, as best as you can. I'll get into that a little bit later, but holding them accountable to the outcomes and the success of the product.
Well, the importance of cross-departmental teams really comes into play here when a product or service touches many departments along the way.
Absolutely. And building a culture that if you appoint a product owner, and they now have authority over some of the things that other departments do, I think you need to build a culture around that and saying that's okay to do. Somebody in this department can dictate what you need to do in your department around something, because they are looking at the big picture. They're looking at the whole thing. Yeah, absolutely. So the number one job of the product owner at the end of the day is to advocate for user needs. That is their number one job. This means they need to know who uses the service. They need to know what they need. And they have to be empowered to work with others, again, across departments, across divisions, to meet those needs. So the product owner needs to be able to tell operations they need to do things differently, or they need to tell the communications team to do things differently. So you need to empower them and give them authority to look at the entirety of this product, and be able to make changes to improve things based on how well the product is performing to meet user needs. So I think the product owner is a really critical piece. And again, I want to differentiate, well, actually not again, I haven't explained this. A product owner is very different from a project manager, right? A project manager is somebody who is charged with getting something done on time and on budget, right? They're a taskmaster. They are looking at what needs to get done across the finish line. A product owner is caring about, yes, we want to get it done, we want to get it on time, but if it doesn't meet user needs, that's a problem. And so they are constantly advocating for user needs throughout the project and after the launch. And so they're very different from a project manager. Sometimes in a small organization, you have to be both, but you should recognize the two roles as different and kind of put one hat on, take the hat off, put another hat on. And so that's a really critical piece. So next slide here. So here's another checklist, kind of a repeat of some of the things that I've talked about, but again, make sure every service has a product owner for it. Give them as much authority as you possibly can to make decisions. I realize like some decisions are going to be above them, are going to be for their boss to make or for their boss's boss to make, but give them as much authority as you can for them to be able to make decisions about how to change and improve the service. And then if they don't have all the authority, create a clear process for them to seek that authority and get decisions made. And then provide them with the training, the support that they need to improve the services. So maybe that's time. Maybe that's dedicated space and time and protecting that. Maybe it's being able to outsource certain things. So maybe it's financial resources, maybe it's time resources. And then also setting measurable goals to hold them accountable to, which can be hard to set the right goals. But I think, I want to say here, it's tough. In government, I feel like we never have enough resources
Right.
to do this work. And so, hold them accountable, but also with an understanding that be compassionate around how you hold them accountable. Because if they really don't have the time and the resources to do, to meet your expectations, you don't want them beating themselves up over it. And you certainly don't want them quitting and leaving because you didn't adequately resource them. So, or getting resentful. So, when things are really floundering and you clearly don't have the resources to do something well, then it's time to start thinking about how you do things really differently. Do you outsource? Do you retire the product, the service altogether? Is it needed anymore? If it is this bad, do we even need to do it at all? And so those are, when people are not meeting expectations because of time and resources, it's a big time for evaluation of how you're doing it.
Yeah, Rebecca, in San Rafael, how did you go about finding out from users what their user needs really were and whether or not products should be retired, enhanced, redesigned, et cetera?
Absolutely. So that actually dovetails nicely into the next couple slides, but I will say it really starts to get into your measurable goals and whether you're meeting your goals. And I'll get into an example. So early on in the pandemic, when the restaurants were, really struggling, we decided we would make a open source map that restaurants could add themselves to and say whether they were open for takeout, open for outdoor dining, open for indoor dining when that was allowed again. And so we created this dynamic map of things. And one of the things we said, well, if we don't hit certain metrics in terms of usage of this map, we're going to retire it. We're not going to maintain something anymore if we're not getting, if people aren't using it, if people don't need it. And at some point we realize we're making this map because it makes sense right now, but it probably won't make sense in 6 months. And actually it's interesting, as we saw over time, some of the Google started adding some of the things that we had put on our map very early on. Google started adding those features.
Oh.
So letting people know if it was if they had outdoor dining, or if they were this or they had that. And so these features started to show up in these bigger and better products than ours. So we thought, you know, once Google takes it and runs with it, we really don't need to maintain our map anymore.
Oh, there you go.
And you know, at some point we will stop investing in it and get rid of the map. So it has to do with your metrics and what you set as important for that. So in the interest of time, because I want to make sure, Charlie, you get to your slides too. So this is about designing with and for real people. So this gets into that work. And, you know, I think this work is hard, is really hard in government, because our services have to work for everyone. We're not like the private sector who gets to choose who their customers are. Our services have to work not just for the wealthy and affluent, not for the well-educated, not just for redheads, not just for people with dogs. They have to work for everyone. So this is the designing services to work for everyone is incredibly difficult. And I'm going to talk about a few things that you'll want to think about. So in the next slide, so number one, this is the most important thing. You are not the user. Uncheck your bias. You are just one person. And really, you know, we oftentimes put ourselves in the shoes of the user, and it's lazy and it's easy, and it's the number one trap. And so really remember, you have to get out and talk to people. You have to learn who your users are. And you really can't mistake yourself for being the user. So you have to listen. So next slide, this is about getting feedback. Get feedback in more than one way. I think we often turn to surveys, and surveys are good for certain things, but they are not good for everything. And so really think about how you can get one-on-one interviews as well as do observations when you're doing digital transformation work. So can you observe people at the permitting counter trying to get permits? Can you watch that happen? Can you have one-on-one interviews with real customers? So people who pay your transient occupancy tax, can you get them on the phone for 20 minutes and ask them questions about their experience paying that tax? So break free from the survey. We often just land on the survey because we know it and we think we can do it okay. But the reality is surveys are really hard to do right. And there are better ways sometimes to get information from people. So next slide. So if there's one thing that you take away from this webinar today, I hope that it's this part. I am a big believer that so many of our problems in the world could be solved if we could just write with clear and plain language. Like, what percentage of your life are you just like confused? It's such a high percentage for me. I mean, taxes, confusing. Healthcare, confusing. Student loans, confusing. Cooking, super confusing, right? Like, just, I'm always confused. So, so please learn about plain language. So the next slide, plain language it's a thing, it's amazing. It helps you convey complex information so that your readers understand and get what they need quickly and with fewer questions and with less confusion. So learning about how to write with plain language, it is magical, and every single public servant should learn it. The benefits are massive. Fewer phone calls, fewer emails, better compliance, services are easier for people to understand, frustration is reduced. It's easier to translate plain language into other languages. So it's such a big deal, and I really encourage you to look into plain language. I have a whole training on plain language I can give. I've got a lot of resources on my website, and the federal government, they have an entire network. So if you go to plainlanguage.gov, they've got tons of free trainings and guides about how to use plain language. This is a critical piece to your government services. If you make a form and people can't understand it, you're in a lot of trouble.
Oh, wow. I'm going to go to that, plainlanguage.com. That's something I
Yeah,
need.
it's a great resource.
Yeah.
So the next slide, so another critical piece of making sure your services work for people, especially digital services, is for them to be accessible. 1 in 4 Americans are living with some type of disability. 10% of Americans are living with a cognitive disability like dyslexia, attention deficit, autism. So again, when your forms or handouts have things that are in all caps lock, italicized, centered text, this is really hard for a good portion of the population to read and to understand. So it's really important to understand how fonts, style, color contrast, your PDFs, there's all sorts of things that you need to pay attention to when you move things online in terms of accessibility, so that, again, everyone has access to your services. So next slide, another checklist for you. This is, I think the only thing here on this checklist that I didn't get into in detail is testing your ideas and prototypes with real users early and often, which is huge when you're taking on digital transformation projects. You really, most IT projects fail. They aren't successful. And so how do you avoid those costly blunders? You test early, you test often. The sooner you learn what works and what doesn't, the earlier you can avoid very, very costly mistakes with things. So think about this when you're hiring government contractors, when you're RFPs. I think you should talk about how you want your vendors to test things, to prototype things, and to learn before the day that you launch. So I think this is a really critical piece. And I would also encourage you, when you're evaluating vendors, to talk to vendors about their own internal process for this, so that they are really practicing this type of work. And questions to ask yourself here. This is, I think, my last slide. But really make sure that you are including people from vulnerable populations when you're getting feedback, and make sure you have a really diverse sample of people that you're getting feedback from. Sometimes we get feedback from people that all look the same, and that doesn't ensure that your services are going to work for everyone. And so with that, I think that concludes my 3-act show entitled The Kitchen Sink. If any of those topics piqued your interest, I'm happy to dive into any of them in particular.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, and I just went to that plainlanguage.com and realized that I need to rewrite some of my staff reports. So.
Absolutely. I've got tools. There's a tool called the Hemingway app. And you can copy and paste text into it, and it will tell you the grade level readability. And it's very fun to put staff reports into it.
Oh my goodness.
You can
What's it called again?
It's called the Hemingway app.com. Yes.
I'm going to look that one up too. And now I'm ashamed to show the rest of my slides because I don't know how plain the language is. But actually, so I just want to summarize that what I'm hearing today and what I hear when I talk to other governments that are going through digital transformation is we need to consider the customer. We need to consider the city, the organization itself. We need to consider the people. And when we have all that together, then I think we can start to put together the technology that achieves all the desired benefits for the customer, the city, and the people. So it's almost like the technology comes last in the whole process. And would you agree with that, Rebecca? Is it?
100%. Yeah, I think that, and that's the work, a lot of times that's the work of service design, and you want to do that service design work before you decide on what technology you're using, because it will inform what type of technology you end up using.
Yeah, as I look at all this and I think about my career, I guess oftentimes I would say, oh, that's a cool piece of technology. And then I'd buy it and think, okay, how am I going to make this work for the customer, the city, or the people?
Right.
And what we're really saying here today is that once we analyze the requirements of the customer, the business, the people, that will drive which technology we select. It's almost like what finance officers go through when they select an ERP. They don't go out and say, oh, I like Tyler Munis, I'm going to buy them. Or I like Springbrook, I'm going to buy them. They actually go through a requirements checklist, and then they'll compare that requirements checklist against all the different technologies and usually select the one that best meets all their requirements. So,
I would also say it's similar to, and I started to do this in San Rafael, where with capital projects, there's a design phase before you go out and bid to contractors. You do the design work ahead of time. And I think that I started to build that phase into technology projects. So before we go out and buy a permitting platform, we do service design work ahead of that. And so building that into your budget and your planning will make these projects in the long term much more successful.
Okay. All right, so one way then to measure all this is if you're looking for a tool, is to build a heat map. And so what this last part of the webinar is about is providing you a digital transformation checklist. And I'm recommending that for each item in the checklist, you use a heat map just to kind of help you assess your requirements and where you're at. And the heat map is going to talk about 6 key areas. I mean, there'll be a heat map for each of these 6 key areas, defining a clear strategy, assessing the organization's digital maturity, describing the business model and the ecosystem, describe the organizational impacts, looking at data technology and leveraging standards and best practice. So I'm not going to read these slides. I'm not going to talk in length about any one item. I'm just going to have it included in the webinar packet that will go out to you following the webinar, so that you have a checklist, if you will, of things to look at. Under defining a clear strategy, there's these 6 items. You put those 6 items into the heat map and then say, what impact will this have on the customer, on the city, on the people, and on the technology itself? Do the same thing for assessing digital maturity. What's our current maturity level and what's our target maturity level? And what impact will that have as we set a target maturity? What impact will that have on each of those 4 key drivers? The business model and ecosystem has a lot more items to put into your heat map. And then describing the organizational impacts. Here's where we get to the culture, the roles and jobs, different kinds of models, governance, if you will. And then the data technology itself, and finally, leveraging standards and best practices and implementing technology projects with an agile methodology where you're continually rolling out, you're getting feedback, and it's a continuous process improvement, it's a continuous business improvement, and as well continuous design improvement. So for those of you that want to connect with us, here's how to connect with Rebecca. Her website is the departmentofcivicthings.com. It's her email, her Instagram, and Twitter. Again, this will all be in the packet that we send out to you. And for those of you that have any follow-up questions for myself or GovInvest, well, this slide has the contact information for both Max and myself. Rebecca, thank you so much for being on this webinar today. Really enjoyed having you here, and I'm sure all of our attendees liked everything that you were saying as well.
Well, and I love the color of your shirt also.
Oh, thank you. And I want to thank the attendees that hung in there to the end. Again, we apologize for the confusion. We'll make it right the next time on our next webinar in a month. So if you like us at GovInvest to help you with your digitization, with your forecasting, well, we're here to help. So thank you for attending, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Charlie.
Bye, Rebecca.